That obsession and its consequences were on full display today in Davos, Switzerland, as the annual meeting of world leaders became an emergency summit. I mean, frantic almost, to deal with an American president who is, not to put too fine a point on it, acting like an evil madman. And they've tried all sorts of strategies up until today, and they're still trying to coddle Trump like a toddler, to flatter him. Now they're facing an ominous fact that has been staring us Americans in the face for a year. The United States is a nuclear-armed superpower run by a would-be tyrant. And they are now talking about him like an enemy.
We need more stability in this world, but we do prefer respect to bullies. We do prefer science to plotism, and we do prefer rule of law to brutality.
Tonight, the headline is the global reaction. At the Davos gathering in Switzerland, world leaders are openly signaling they're done trying to manage Donald Trump with flattery, and are instead describing a tougher, more unified posture toward the United States under his leadership. What's confirmed in this segment is the sharp shift in tone. Allies and partners are publicly talking about the U.S. as a destabilizing force and emphasizing strength, unity, and resistance to coercion. What is not confirmed here is any single coordinated policy response or a formal new alliance structure announced at Davos in this clip. What we have is the rhetoric, the warning, and the intent to push back. This matters because Davos is normally built for carefully scripted diplomacy and economic messaging. In this account, it's being treated more like an emergency session. Leaders focused on containing risk tied to U.S. actions, and on what they say is a new era of instability.
Things are so dire, the Prime Minister of Canada, our steadfast ally to the north, our neighbor, gave one of the best, most clear-eyed, sober, urgent speeches that I've heard a politician deliver in a very, very long time. And certainly not the usual kind of speech that we hear at places like Davos.
Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. The powerful have their power. But we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together.
The clearest example comes from Canada's Prime Minister, delivering what's described here as an unusually blunt and urgent speech for that setting. The message: major powers are now using economic integration as a weapon, tariffs as leverage, financial systems as tools of pressure, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to exploit. And the warning is structural, not rhetorical. When countries negotiate one-on-one with a dominant power, they negotiate from weakness, competing to be the most accommodating. The argument is that this looks like sovereignty on the surface, but functionally becomes subordination. The proposed answer is collective strength. Stop pretending, name what's happening, build resilience at home, and act together rather than separately. That speech lands inside a broader claim in this segment, that the old global order is no longer just changing but breaking, moving from transition to disruption. And Davos attendees, we're told, didn't just hear it in speeches, they saw a symbolic message in the mountains outside town. A group of local residents reportedly hiked with torches and spelled out a message visible across the valley: "No kings." In the context of this broadcast, it's presented as a public rebuke, an on-the-ground reflection of the same resistance being voiced inside Davos. From there, the script turns to the broader one-year assessment of Trump's return to office, described here as brutal and destabilizing across multiple fronts. The segment cites mass, heavily armed federal immigration operations that, in this telling, have left residents of Minneapolis feeling subjected to what's described as a violent and lawless occupation. It also describes the president musing about deploying American soldiers and the Justice Department repeatedly targeting local elected leaders. Economically, the account says conditions are deteriorating, from unemployment to inflation, and specifically links that to tariffs imposed unilaterally, described as hundreds of billions, potentially trillions, in new taxes on the American public. The Dow is also cited here as dropping nearly 900 points in a single day. On foreign policy, the segment lists a rapid series of escalations. It claims Trump seized and captured the president of Venezuela, brought him to the United States, announced the U.S. would take Venezuela's oil and sell it, and place proceeds in a private offshore bank account in Qatar controlled by Trump. It also says Trump has threatened to bomb Iran, raising the prospect of war. The broadcast frames those actions as tied to an obsession with personal recognition, specifically mentioning Greenland and the Nobel Peace Prize, arguing that this fixation and its consequences were on display at Davos, as leaders tried to respond to what they view as unpredictable and aggressive U.S. behavior. That's the turn in the storyline. Leaders, after what's described as months of attempting to flatter and manage Trump, are now publicly speaking about him in adversarial terms, saying they prefer stability, respect over bullying, science over propaganda, and rule of law over brutality. The argument is that Trump responds only to force, strength, and unity, and therefore Europe and America's partners should demonstrate exactly that. The segment then pivots to what it portrays as a striking contrast. While Trump is set to speak at Davos, the rest of the world is described here as calling him a central threat to peace and stability, even as he publicly boasts about accomplishments and claims he should have received Nobel recognition for wars he says he stopped, along with comments suggesting Norway controls the Nobel process. The script also describes a White House-prepared list of purported accomplishments printed out for Trump to read, including items like ending the use of paper straws and removing Hunter Biden's taxpayer-funded Secret Service detail, and it says this comes just days after Trump announced the creation of a Board of Peace intended to supplant the United Nations, run by him, with member states charged $1 billion for a permanent seat. The segment claims Trump invited leaders, including Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Benjamin Netanyahu, and sought to strong-arm leaders from countries like Hungary and Belarus. Finally, the piece zeroes in on a personal diplomatic exchange, described as emblematic of the moment. Over the weekend, Trump is said to have received a text from Norway's prime minister, portrayed as flattering and intended to ease tensions tied to U.S. positions on Greenland, Gaza, and Ukraine. The segment says Trump replied by referencing the Nobel Prize, stating he no longer felt obligated to think purely of peace, and then insisting on taking Denmark and taking Greenland. The conclusion here is blunt. Electing Trump doesn't remain a domestic issue because the U.S. sits at the center of the global order. The segment argues that post-World War II, U.S. hegemony has been abused in destructive ways, from Vietnam to Iraq and beyond, but also served as an avoid World War system, built on the lesson that autocratic, expansionist regimes can trigger World War. And what the world is confronting now, in this telling, is that the order the victors built is crumbling, because the hegemon is sounding and possibly acting like an aggressive power itself. The script ends by saying America's allies are arriving at a realization that anti-Trump Americans have felt since the first day of this term, pointing to the president's unilateral pardons for January 6th participants, including those convicted of violent assaults and seditious conspiracy, as evidence in this account that the most powerful person in the world is a danger to stability and is actively making the world order more unstable.